America stayed out of World War I for 3 years while Europe tore itself apart. Then, in 1917, they jumped in. And that decision would haunt the world for the next 100 years. April 2, 1917, President Woodrow Wilson stood before Congress and asked them to declare war on Germany. For nearly 3 years, America had watched Europe destroy itself. Millions were dead. Empires were collapsing. The continent was drowning in blood. And America had stayed out of it, safe across the Atlantic Ocean. But here's what nobody tells you about America entering World War I. This wasn't about defending freedom or making the world safe for democracy, no matter what the propaganda said. This was about money, power, and a series of German mistakes so stupid that they forced America's hand. And the consequences of America joining that war are still affecting us today, because American involvement didn't just help win World War I. It helped create the conditions for World War II, the Cold War, and America's role as global superpower. This is the story of how America got dragged into a European war it desperately wanted to avoid. How a country built on avoiding European conflicts became the deciding factor in the biggest war the world had ever seen. And how that decision changed everything. Let's start with where America was in 1914 when the war began. America in 1914 was not the superpower we know today, not even close. America was powerful, sure. It had the largest economy in the world. American industry was booming. Steel production in Pittsburgh, automobile manufacturing in Detroit, oil production in Texas. American cities were growing rapidly. New York, Chicago, Philadelphia were becoming major urban centers with millions of residents. American technology was advancing. The Wright brothers had achieved powered flight just 11 years earlier. Edison's electric light was transforming cities. The telephone was connecting the country. American innovation was leading the world in many areas. But militarily, America was weak, really weak. The U.S. Army in 1914 had about 100,000 men. That's tiny. France had an army of nearly 4 million when mobilized. Germany had over 4 million. Russia had over 5 million. Britain had a small professional army of about 250,000 but could mobilize millions more from its empire. And America had 100,000 guys, many of whom were scattered across the country at various forts and posts, dealing with things like border security with Mexico and garrison duty in the Philippines and other territories. The American army wasn't prepared for modern warfare. They didn't have the equipment. They had some artillery, but nothing like the massive guns the Europeans were using. They had rifles, but not enough for a mass army. They didn't have machine guns in significant numbers. They didn't have tanks because tanks hadn't been invented yet. They didn't have experience with trench warfare. The last major war America had fought was the Spanish-American War in 1898, which had been a relatively small conflict lasting only a few months. American officers had studied European military tactics, but studying something and actually doing it are very different things. The army was also geographically dispersed. There were posts along the Mexican border because relations with Mexico were tense. There was a revolution going on in Mexico, and Pancho Villa had actually raided American territory in 1916. General John Pershing had led an expedition into Mexico to chase Villa, but never caught him. There were American forces in the Philippines, which America had taken from Spain in 1898. There were troops scattered at various coastal fortifications. The army wasn't concentrated and ready to deploy to Europe on short notice. The U.S. Navy was better. America had been building up its Navy since the 1890s, partly to protect its growing overseas interests, and partly because Theodore Roosevelt, who had been president from 1901 to 1909, loved battleships and believed in naval power. Roosevelt had sent the Great White Fleet, a group of battleships painted white, on a world tour from 1907 to 1909 to show off American naval strength. The Navy had modern battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. But even the Navy wasn't anywhere close to Britain's Royal Navy, which was by far the most powerful navy in the world, with dozens of dreadnought battleships and hundreds of other vessels. More importantly, America had no desire to get involved in European wars. This was a core principle of American foreign policy going back to George Washington. Washington's farewell address in 1796 warned against permanent alliances with foreign nations. He said America should have commercial relations with all countries, but political connections with none. America should stay out of European conflicts and focus on its own development. This became known as isolationism, though that's not quite the right word. America wasn't isolated from the world. American businesses traded with everyone. American diplomats maintained relations with most countries. American missionaries went abroad. American tourists visited Europe. But America avoided military alliances and tried to stay neutral in European conflicts. This made sense for practical and ideological reasons. The Atlantic Ocean was a huge barrier. In 1914, crossing the Atlantic took about a week by ship. There were no airplanes that could cross the ocean. Communication was faster thanks to undersea telegraph cables, but moving people and goods was slow. America was far away from European conflicts, separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Why get involved in wars happening on another continent? Let the Europeans fight their own wars. America had its own concerns, and American concerns in 1914 were substantial. The country was dealing with massive immigration. Between 1880 and 1920, over 20 million immigrants came to America, primarily from Europe. This was changing the character of American society. There were debates about how to integrate these immigrants, what it meant to be American, whether immigration should be restricted. There were labor conflicts as workers organized into unions and fought for better wages and conditions. There were strikes, sometimes violent. The government was dealing with the Progressive-era reforms, trying to regulate big business, improve working conditions, give women the right to vote, address corruption in politics. There was the question of what to do about segregation and the treatment of Black Americans in the South. There was expansion and development of the West, building railroads, building infrastructure, electrifying cities, connecting the country. There was plenty to do at home without worrying about European politics, and American public opinion strongly supported staying out of European wars. America was a country of immigrants with ties to many different countries. There were millions of German Americans, descendants of German immigrants. Many lived in the Midwest, in places like Wisconsin, Ohio, Pennsylvania. They maintained German cultural traditions, spoke German, read German-language newspapers. They didn't want to fight against Germany. There were millions of Irish Americans who hated Britain because Britain ruled Ireland, often brutally. Irish Americans certainly didn't want to fight alongside Britain. There were millions of Italian Americans with ties to Italy, millions of Jewish immigrants who had fled persecution in Russia, millions of Poles, Greeks, Scandinavians, all with connections to different parts of Europe. Getting America involved in a European war would divide the country along ethnic lines. It would pit Irish Americans against British Americans, German Americans against everyone else. It would create internal conflict. Better to stay neutral and avoid tearing the country apart. This was the overwhelming sentiment in 1914. So when World War I started in August 1914, President Woodrow Wilson immediately declared American neutrality. On August 4th, just days after the war began, Wilson issued a proclamation of neutrality. America would not take sides. America would continue trading with everyone. America would respect the rights of all belligerents. America would stay out of it. Wilson personally gave a speech asking Americans to be impartial in thought as well as action. He wanted Americans to not even pick sides mentally, to remain completely neutral in their sympathies. This seemed like the smart move. Let Europe exhaust itself fighting. America would remain at peace. American businesses would profit by selling supplies to whoever wanted to buy them. And when the war ended, America would be stronger than ever while Europe was weakened. America could emerge as the dominant power without firing a shot. It was a reasonable strategy. But neutrality turned out to be way more complicated than Wilson expected because both sides in the war wanted American support, or at least they wanted to prevent America from helping the other side. And both sides were willing to do things that violated American neutrality and pushed America toward war. Neither side really respected American neutrality because they were fighting for their survival and couldn't afford to let legal niceties get in the way. Let's talk about the economic situation first, because this is absolutely crucial to understanding why America eventually joined the war. When the war started, American businesses began selling supplies to both sides. Food, raw materials, manufactured goods, everything the armies needed. Wheat, corn, beef, pork for feeding soldiers, cotton for uniforms, copper for shell casings, steel for weapons, oil for vehicles, chemicals for explosives. This was legal under international law. Neutral countries could trade with belligerents as long as they traded with both sides equally. Business was business. If Europeans wanted to kill each other, American businesses would happily sell them the means to do so. But Britain's naval blockade changed everything almost immediately. Britain used its superior navy to cut off Germany from overseas trade. Britain controlled the seas. British warships patrolled the waters around Germany and the North Sea. British ships stopped and searched vessels heading to Germany. If they were carrying goods that could help the German war effort, Britain seized them. This included not just obvious military goods like weapons, but also food, raw materials, anything that might help Germany continue fighting. This was called the blockade, and it was incredibly effective at strangling Germany economically. The blockade was enforced ruthlessly. British warships would stop merchant vessels, even neutral ones, and force them to go to British ports for inspection. If the cargo was deemed contraband, Britain would seize it. Sometimes Britain would seize the entire ship. Neutral countries, including America, protested that this violated international law. They were right, technically. International law at the time had strict rules about blockades and what could be considered contraband. Britain was stretching these rules to the breaking point and beyond. But Britain didn't care. They were fighting for survival. Germany had invaded Belgium and France and was trying to crush them. Britain couldn't afford to play by rules while fighting for its existence. Legal niceties could wait until after the war, and Britain calculated, correctly, that America wouldn't push too hard on this issue. Why? Because American businesses were making huge amounts of money selling to Britain and France, and America's economic interests aligned with Britain winning. Think about it from a business perspective. Germany was cut off by the British blockade. German ports were blockaded. German ships couldn't get out. Neutral ships couldn't get in, or if they tried, they were stopped by the British Navy. So American companies couldn't sell to Germany even if they wanted to. There was no way to get goods to Germany. But Britain and France desperately needed supplies. They were buying everything America could produce: food to feed their armies and civilians, raw materials to keep their factories running, manufactured goods because their own industries were converting to war production, and they were paying good money for it. Britain and France had wealth from their colonial empires. They had gold reserves. They could pay. American businesses boomed. Factories expanded to meet the demand. New factories were built. Jobs were created. Unemployment fell. Wages rose. The economy grew rapidly. Between 1914 and 1917, American exports to Britain and France increased by over 300%. In 1914, America exported about $800 million worth of goods to the Allies. By 1916, that had risen to over $3 billion. That's a massive increase. We're talking billions of dollars in early 20th century money, which would be tens of billions in today's money. The American economy became deeply tied to the Allied war effort. American prosperity depended on the Allies continuing to buy American goods. And it wasn't just goods. Britain and France needed money to pay for all these supplies. At first, they paid with gold and with their own reserves, but as the war dragged on and the costs mounted, they ran out of money. So they turned to American banks for loans. J.P. Morgan and Company became the primary agent for British and French purchasing in America. Morgan arranged huge loans from American banks to Britain and France. By 1917, Britain and France owed American banks over $2 billion. That's an enormous sum. In today's money, we're talking about tens of billions of dollars, maybe over $100 billion depending on how you calculate it. This created a huge financial stake in the outcome of the war. If Britain and France lost the war, they might not be able to pay back those loans. Germany might repudiate the debts, or Britain and France might be so economically devastated that they couldn't pay. American banks would lose billions. The American financial system would be destabilized. There might be bank failures, a financial panic, economic depression. American banks had a vested interest in Britain and France winning the war so they could be repaid. So, even though America was officially neutral, the American economy was tied to the Allied cause. American businesses wanted the Allies to win because that's who was buying their products. American banks wanted the Allies to win because that's who owed them money. Workers wanted the Allies to win because Allied purchases meant jobs. This wasn't a conspiracy or a sinister plot. This was just capitalism working as it normally does. Follow the money, and you'll understand why America leaned toward the Allies even while claiming neutrality. The Wilson administration understood this and didn't really try to stop it. Wilson's Secretary of State at the start of the war was William Jennings Bryan, a progressive Democrat who genuinely wanted neutrality. Bryan proposed banning loans to belligerents, arguing that if American banks weren't financially tied to one side, America could remain truly neutral. But Wilson rejected this idea. He was influenced by his advisors, particularly Robert Lansing, who would replace Bryan as Secretary of State in 1915. Lansing argued that banning loans would hurt the American economy. American businesses needed to sell to Europe. European countries needed loans to buy from America. If America banned loans, American exports would collapse. American businesses would fail. Unemployment would skyrocket. It would be economic suicide. So Wilson allowed the loans. He convinced himself this was still neutral because, in theory, Germany could also borrow from American banks if they wanted to. The fact that Germany couldn't actually access American credit because of the British blockade wasn't America's fault. Wilson was technically neutral while being practically pro-Allied. It was a compromise that satisfied his conscience while allowing American economic interests to align with Britain and France. Germany understood this very clearly. They knew that American industry was feeding the Allied war machine. They knew that American loans were keeping Britain and France financially afloat. They knew that without American supplies, Britain and France might be forced to negotiate. From Germany's perspective, America wasn't really neutral. America was helping their enemies. America was an arsenal for the Allies. Germany protested loudly and repeatedly about this, arguing that real neutrality would mean cutting off Britain and France from American supplies, just as the British blockade had cut off Germany. But Germany's protests fell on deaf ears. The Wilson administration would point out that international law allowed neutral countries to trade with belligerents. If Germany had a problem with British warships stopping American vessels, that was between Germany and Britain. America was just exercising its legal rights to trade. It was true, but it ignored the reality that American trade was heavily one-sided and was materially helping Britain and France while Germany got nothing. Germany protested that the British blockade itself was illegal, and they were right about that too. But again, Wilson didn't push hard on Britain. There were protests, diplomatic notes, complaints, but no real pressure. Wilson's pro-British sympathies and America's economic interests meant he was willing to tolerate British violations of international law while being much less tolerant of German violations. So, Germany decided to use the one advantage they had: submarines. Germany couldn't challenge Britain's surface navy. The British Royal Navy had dozens of battleships, over 100 cruisers, hundreds of destroyers and smaller vessels. Germany's high seas fleet was powerful but smaller. The Germans had tried to build up their fleet before the war, but they couldn't match Britain. And when it came to actual fighting, the German fleet largely stayed in port after the Battle of Jutland in 1916, which was tactically inconclusive, but strategically meant Germany couldn't break the blockade with surface ships. But Germany had developed a new weapon, the U-boat, short for Unterseeboot, German for submarine. German U-boats were advanced for their time. They could slip past British patrols undetected. They could lurk beneath the surface and attack merchant ships bringing supplies to Britain. Germany had about 20 to 30 U-boats operational at any given time in 1915, which doesn't sound like many, but submarines were a new technology, and even a small number could have a big impact if used aggressively. Submarine warfare created a huge problem under international law. Traditional naval warfare had rules that had evolved over centuries. These rules were designed to minimize harm to neutral countries and civilians. If a warship wanted to stop a merchant vessel, it was supposed to surface, signal the merchant ship to stop, send a boarding party to search the ship and check its cargo, allow the crew to evacuate into lifeboats if the ship was going to be sunk, and only then sink the ship if it was carrying contraband or belonged to an enemy nation. This gave merchant crews a chance to survive. It protected neutral vessels. It was considered civilized warfare, but submarines couldn't follow these rules. Submarines were fragile. A submarine on the surface was vulnerable. If a U-boat surfaced to search a merchant ship, several things could happen, all bad for the submarine. The merchant ship could ram the submarine, which was a real danger because submarines are slow and difficult to maneuver on the surface. The merchant ship might be armed with guns, and many British merchant ships were given defensive weapons precisely to fight submarines. The crew might have small arms and could shoot at the submarine crew. A surfaced submarine was also visible to enemy warships and could be attacked. And while the submarine was on the surface dealing with one merchant ship, other merchant ships in a convoy could get away. For submarines to be effective, they had to attack without warning. Surface, fire torpedoes, sink the ship, submerge, and leave quickly. This was the only way submarine warfare made sense from a tactical perspective, but attacking without warning meant killing civilians. Merchant ship crews and passengers didn't have time to evacuate. They went down with the ship. This was considered barbaric by international law standards of the time. In February 1915, Germany announced a war zone around Britain. The announcement said that starting February 18th, all waters around the British Isles would be considered a war zone. Any enemy merchant ship found in these waters would be destroyed, and it might not always be possible to warn crews or passengers. Germany explicitly warned neutral countries to keep their ships out of the war zone because they might be attacked by mistake. U-boats might not be able to identify a ship's nationality before attacking. Germany presented this as their response to the British blockade. If Britain was going to starve Germany by cutting off their trade, Germany would starve Britain by sinking ships bringing supplies. It was retaliation in kind. Germany argued this was justified under international law as a response to Britain's illegal blockade. But it was a huge escalation. This was threatening to sink civilian ships, including neutral ones, without warning. President Wilson was furious when he heard about Germany's announcement. He sent a strongly worded note to Germany on February 10, 1915. The note said that if Germany's submarines destroyed American ships or killed American citizens, Germany would be held to strict accountability. That phrase, strict accountability, was deliberately vague but implied serious consequences, possibly war. Wilson was drawing a line. He was saying America would not tolerate attacks on American ships or American lives. But Wilson was also bluffing to some extent. He didn't really want war. He was hoping the threat would make Germany back down. He believed in the power of international law and diplomatic pressure. He thought Germany would realize that alienating America was too dangerous and would modify their submarine campaign to avoid killing Americans. Wilson underestimated how desperate Germany was and how important they thought submarine warfare was to their chances of winning. It didn't work. German U-boats began sinking merchant ships in the war zone. Some were British, some were neutral. In March 1915, a U-boat sank the Falaba, a British passenger ship. Over 100 people died, including one American. In April, a U-boat attacked the American tanker Gulflight. The ship didn't sink, but 3 Americans died during the attack. Wilson protested but didn't take military action. He was still hoping to avoid war. Then came May 7, 1915, the day that changed everything. A German U-boat, the U-20, commanded by Kapitän Leutnant Walter Schwieger, torpedoed and sank the Lusitania, a British passenger liner traveling from New York to Liverpool. The Lusitania was one of the largest and most luxurious ships in the world, owned by the Cunard Line. It could carry over 2,000 passengers and crew. On this voyage, it had about 1,900 people on board. The U-20 was patrolling off the southern coast of Ireland, waiting for targets. Around 2 p.m. on May 7th, Schwieger spotted the Lusitania through his periscope. It was a huge ship, unmistakable. Schwieger made the decision to attack. He fired one torpedo. The torpedo hit the Lusitania on the starboard side. There was a massive explosion, then a second explosion. The second explosion was probably caused by something in the cargo, though exactly what has been debated. The ship began sinking immediately. The Lusitania went down. In just 18 minutes, it sank so fast that many lifeboats couldn't be launched. People jumped into the cold water. Over 1,190 people died. Among the dead were 128 Americans, including some prominent wealthy Americans and some children. The sinking was a disaster and a shock to the world. American public opinion exploded with rage. How could Germany sink a passenger ship carrying civilians? How could they kill innocent Americans who were just traveling? How could they kill women and children? The newspapers were filled with outrage. There were horrifying stories of children drowning, of women separated from their families, of the chaos as the ship went down. Political cartoons depicted Germans as barbaric Huns killing babies. Theodore Roosevelt, the former president who was always ready for a fight, demanded war. He called Wilson a coward for not immediately declaring war on Germany. He said real men would fight to defend American honor. There were anti-German riots in some American cities. German-owned businesses had their windows smashed. German Americans faced harassment and threats. People with German last names sometimes anglicized them to avoid being targeted. The rage was real and widespread. Many Americans felt that this was the final straw, that Germany had crossed a line, that war was now necessary. But Wilson held back. He didn't want war. He still believed America's role should be to help negotiate peace, not join the fighting. Wilson gave speeches about being too proud to fight, which Roosevelt and others mocked as weakness. Wilson sent a strong diplomatic protest to Germany. He demanded that Germany stop unrestricted submarine warfare. He demanded that Germany provide guarantees for the safety of American ships and American passengers. He demanded compensation for the American dead. But he didn't ask Congress to declare war. Why not? Several reasons. First, Wilson genuinely believed in peace and neutrality. He thought America could do more good as a mediator than as a participant. Second, he knew the country was divided. Yes, people were angry about the Lusitania, but were they angry enough to send their sons to die in European trenches? Wilson wasn't sure. There was a lot of anti-war sentiment, especially in the Midwest and among German Americans and Irish Americans. Third, Wilson was facing a re-election campaign in 1916 and knew that war would be politically divisive. Also, the Lusitania situation was more complicated than it seemed. Germany claimed the ship was carrying weapons and ammunition for Britain, which made it a legitimate military target under the laws of war. Germany had even placed advertisements in American newspapers before the Lusitania sailed, warning Americans not to travel on British ships in the war zone. Germany was arguing that they had given warning, that the ship was a legitimate target, and that passengers traveled at their own risk. And Germany was right about the cargo. The Lusitania was carrying, rifle ammunition and artillery shells in its cargo hold, about 173 tons of ammunition. Britain was using passenger ships to transport war materials, knowing that Germany would be reluctant to sink them because of the civilians on board. So, in a sense, Britain was using civilians as human shields for military cargo. This doesn't justify killing over 1,000 people, but it meant Germany had an argument that the sinking wasn't pure terrorism. It was attacking a military target that happened to have civilians on board. This complexity gave Wilson room to avoid war. He could argue that the situation was ambiguous, that more diplomacy was needed, that America shouldn't rush to judgment. He sent diplomatic notes to Germany demanding changes to their submarine warfare policy. He also sent notes to Britain complaining about the blockade and about Britain using passenger ships to carry weapons. He tried to appear even-handed. Germany, facing the threat of American entry into the war, backed down temporarily. The German government was divided on submarine warfare. The Navy wanted to sink everything and argued this was the only way to win. But the civilian government worried about bringing America into the war. Chancellor Theobald von Bethmann-Hollweg argued that attacking passenger ships was counterproductive because it would turn world opinion against Germany and might bring America in. After a series of diplomatic exchanges and more sinkings that killed Americans, Germany issued what became known as the Arabic Pledge in August 1915, and then the Sussex Pledge in May 1916. These pledges promised that Germany would not sink passenger ships without warning and would allow crews to evacuate before sinking merchant ships. Germany agreed to restrict submarine warfare to reduce the risk of American casualties. This satisfied Wilson for the moment. The crisis passed. America remained neutral. But here's the thing about American neutrality. It was always tilted toward the Allies, and everyone knew it. Wilson might have wanted to be neutral, but his actions and his administration's policies favored Britain and France. His advisors were mostly pro-British. His closest advisor, Colonel Edward House, was basically a secret channel to British leaders. House regularly met with British officials, sometimes without Wilson's full knowledge, and coordinated policy. House believed America and Britain shared interests and values and should work together. Wilson himself admired British culture and institutions. He had studied British parliamentary systems. He respected British democracy. He saw Britain as a fellow Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, democratic nation. He saw Germany as militaristic, autocratic, aggressive. These cultural biases affected his decision-making even when he tried to be neutral. Many wealthy and educated Americans had similar pro-British biases. American elites often went to Britain for education or travel. They read British literature. They followed British news. They saw Britain as the mother country, the source of American legal and political traditions. Yes, America had fought Britain in the Revolution and the War of 1812, but that was a long time ago. By 1914, there was a sense of cultural kinship, at least among upper-class Americans. Language mattered too. Americans spoke English. British propaganda was written in English and was easy for Americans to understand and relate to. British propaganda was sophisticated. Britain had skilled writers and artists creating material that portrayed Britain as fighting for civilization against German barbarism. Stories of German atrocities in Belgium, some real and some exaggerated or fabricated, filled American newspapers. The image of brutal German soldiers bayoneting Belgian babies was repeated over and over, whether it was true or not. German propaganda, by contrast, was often translated poorly or didn't resonate with American audiences. German attempts to portray themselves as defending civilization against Russian barbarism didn't work in America because Americans didn't fear Russia the way Germans did. German cultural references didn't land. German arguments seemed heavy-handed and unconvincing. Britain also controlled the undersea telegraph cables connecting Europe to America. This meant news from Europe came through British sources or was filtered through British control. Britain could influence what information reached America. They could emphasize German atrocities and play down their own actions. They could shape the narrative. Germany tried to counter this with their own propaganda, but they were playing on Britain's home field. So Americans heard constantly about German atrocities in Belgium, about German use of poison gas, about German submarine warfare killing civilians, about German militarism and brutality. They heard less about British imperialism in Ireland and India and Africa. They heard less about British war crimes, and there were some, though not on the scale of German actions in Belgium. They heard less about the stupidity of British generals sending men on suicidal attacks, or about British manipulation of American public opinion. The information environment was tilted toward sympathy for Britain and France. This cultural and information advantage meant that even Americans who wanted to stay neutral tended to sympathize with Britain and France when they thought about the war. They pictured brave French soldiers and British Tommies defending civilization against the German onslaught. They pictured plucky little Belgium resisting German invasion. They didn't think as much about the complex web of alliances and imperial rivalries that had actually started the war. The narrative was simplified to good guys versus bad guys, and Germany was cast as the bad guy. The election of 1916 was fought partly over the war issue. Wilson ran for re-election against Charles Evans Hughes, a Republican and former Supreme Court Justice. Hughes was more hawkish than Wilson. He criticized Wilson for being too soft on Germany. He wanted stronger action to protect American rights. He had support from Theodore Roosevelt and other Republicans who wanted a more aggressive foreign policy. Wilson ran on his record of keeping America out of war. His campaign slogan was, "He kept us out of war." This appealed to Americans, especially in the Midwest and West, who didn't want their sons dying in Europe. Wilson argued that he had defended American rights and American honor without resorting to war. He argued that he had negotiated with Germany and gotten them to stop attacking passenger ships. He presented himself as the peace candidate. The election was close. Wilson won narrowly, largely because he carried California by less than 4,000 votes. If California had gone for Hughes, Hughes would have been president. Wilson's victory seemed like a mandate for continued neutrality. The American people had voted for peace. Wilson took this seriously. He believed the people had spoken, and they wanted him to keep America out of the war. But Wilson was also frustrated by his failure to negotiate peace. He had tried repeatedly to mediate between the warring powers. He had sent Colonel House to Europe multiple times to meet with British, French, and German leaders and explore possibilities for peace. But neither side was willing to compromise. Both sides thought they could still win. Both sides had sacrificed too much to accept a compromised peace. Britain and France had specific war aims. They wanted to defeat Germany decisively. They wanted to recover Alsace-Lorraine for France. They wanted to break up the Ottoman Empire and take its territories. They wanted reparations from Germany. They wanted to ensure Germany could never threaten them again. They weren't interested in a peace that left Germany strong. Germany also had ambitious war aims. They wanted to keep Belgium. They wanted parts of France. They wanted to dominate Eastern Europe. They wanted their rivals weakened. German military leaders believed they could achieve victory, especially after Russia started to collapse. Why negotiate when you might win? So Wilson's peace efforts went nowhere. Both sides paid lip service to Wilson's mediation attempts, but didn't seriously engage. They made impossible demands as conditions for negotiation, knowing the other side wouldn't accept. Wilson found this incredibly frustrating. He believed he was offering a way out of the bloodbath, and nobody would take it. He began to think that only American involvement could force a reasonable peace, though he wasn't yet ready to actually join the war. By early 1917, the war had reached a terrible stalemate. On the Western Front, both sides were dug into trenches stretching from the English Channel to Switzerland. Attacks cost hundreds of thousands of lives for gains measured in yards. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 killed over 700,000 French and German soldiers combined for, essentially, no territorial change. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 killed over 1 million men on all sides, and the British gained a few miles at most. The war had become a meat grinder. Both sides were bleeding to death slowly. The Eastern Front was more fluid but equally brutal. Russia had suffered massive casualties, millions of men killed, wounded, or captured. The Russian economy was collapsing. Russian society was on the verge of revolution. Germany had won major victories in the East, but Russia was so huge that even victories didn't end the war. The Germans kept having to advance further and further into Russian territory, stretching their supply lines without achieving a decisive end. The war had become a contest of endurance. Which side would collapse first? Which side could endure the losses longer? Which side would run out of men, money, and morale first? Both sides were exhausted. Both sides had internal problems, but neither side was willing to quit because that would mean all the sacrifices had been for nothing. Germany faced a terrible choice in late 1916 and early 1917. The British blockade was strangling Germany. Food was becoming scarce. In the winter of 1916-1917, called the Turnip Winter, Germans were reduced to eating turnips because other food wasn't available. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians would die from malnutrition and diseases related to hunger during the war. Industrial production was hampered by lack of raw materials. Copper, rubber, oil, all the materials needed for modern war were in short supply. Germany was slowly being strangled economically. Germany needed to break the stalemate soon, or they would lose simply by being worn down. But how? They couldn't break through on the Western Front. Every attack cost enormous casualties and gained little. They couldn't force Britain and France to negotiate. What could they do? German military leaders, particularly Admiral Henning von Holtzendorf, the chief of the naval staff, came up with a plan: unrestricted submarine warfare. Use U-boats to sink everything heading to Britain. Sink merchant ships, passenger ships, neutral ships, everything. Starve Britain into submission. The German Navy calculated that if they could sink 600,000 tons of shipping per month, Britain would be forced to surrender within 6 months. Britain depended on imports for food and raw materials. If shipping was disrupted enough, Britain couldn't feed its people or supply its war industries. Britain would have to quit. The plan was risky because it would likely bring America into the war. German leaders knew that sinking American ships and killing Americans would probably provoke Wilson to declare war. But they thought they could win before America mattered. America's army was tiny. It would take at least a year, maybe 2, to train and equip a large army and ship it to Europe. Germany could starve Britain into submission in 6 months. America entering the war wouldn't matter if Britain had already surrendered and France was left fighting alone. This was a calculated gamble. German civilian leaders, including Chancellor Bethmann Hollweg, were skeptical. They worried that bringing America in would be disastrous in the long run. America's economic power was enormous. America's potential military power was huge. Even if it took time to mobilize, once America fully committed to the war, Germany would be overwhelmed. But the military leaders argued that Germany had no other options. Without unrestricted submarine warfare, Germany would lose slowly. With it, Germany might win quickly. It was worth the risk. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had been sidelined for much of the war as military leaders took control, was persuaded by the military arguments. On January 9, 1917, he agreed to resume unrestricted submarine warfare starting February 1st. On January 31st, Germany publicly announced this decision. All ships, including American ships, in the war zone around Britain would be sunk without warning. Germany knew this meant war with America, but they thought it was their only chance to win. President Wilson was backed into a corner. He had warned Germany repeatedly about submarine warfare. He had said Germany would be held to strict accountability. He had gotten Germany to pledge to restrict submarine warfare. Now, Germany had broken those pledges and was announcing they would sink American ships without warning. If Wilson didn't respond forcefully, he would look weak and foolish. His threats would be meaningless. His credibility would be destroyed. The country would lose respect for him. But if he did respond, America would be at war. Wilson was deeply conflicted. He had spent 2.5 years trying to keep America out of the war. He had just won re-election on a peace platform. He genuinely believed America could do more good as a mediator than as a combatant. But Germany was forcing his hand. On February 3, 1917, Wilson broke diplomatic relations with Germany. The American ambassador left Berlin. The German ambassador left Washington. This was a step short of war, but it was moving in that direction. Wilson was still hoping that somehow war could be avoided, that Germany would back down, or that circumstances would change. Wilson also went before Congress and asked for authority to arm American merchant ships so they could defend themselves against U-boats. This was called armed neutrality. American ships would carry guns and would fight back if attacked. Some members of Congress opposed even this limited step, fearing it would lead to war. A group of anti-war senators, led by Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, filibustered the armed ship bill. Wilson was furious. He called them a little group of willful men who were preventing America from defending itself. Eventually, Wilson found legal authority to arm ships without congressional approval, and did so. German U-boats began sinking American ships almost immediately. In March 1917, several American merchant vessels were torpedoed. Americans died. Each sinking created more public outrage and more pressure on Wilson to declare war. The ships weren't passenger liners like the Lusitania, they were cargo vessels, but Americans were still being killed. Wilson had said this would lead to strict accountability. Now he had to follow through or lose all credibility. Then came the Zimmermann telegram, which became the final push that made war inevitable. This was one of the biggest diplomatic blunders in history, a mistake so catastrophic that it almost seems like Germany was trying to bring America into the war. Arthur Zimmermann was Germany's foreign secretary, essentially their equivalent of Secretary of State. In January 1917, as Germany was preparing to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, Zimmermann had an idea. He worried that America might enter the war. He thought about how Germany could keep America distracted and unable to send troops to Europe. His solution was to get Mexico to attack America. On January 16, 1917, Zimmermann sent a coded telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. The telegram instructed the ambassador to approach the Mexican government with a proposal. If America entered the war against Germany, Germany would form an alliance with Mexico. Germany would provide financial support to Mexico. And when Germany won the war, Germany would help Mexico recover territory it had lost to the United States in the 1840s, Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Germany was proposing to help Mexico invade and conquer large parts of the American Southwest. The telegram also suggested that Mexico should try to get Japan to join this alliance against America. Japan and America had been having tensions over various issues, including American discrimination against Japanese immigrants and competing interests in China and the Pacific. Zimmerman thought maybe Japan could be persuaded to attack American possessions in the Pacific while Mexico attacked from the south. It was an absurd idea on multiple levels. Mexico had no ability to invade the United States. Mexico was in the middle of a revolution. The Mexican government was barely in control of its own country. Different factions were fighting each other. The last thing Mexico could do was launch an invasion of the United States. The Mexican army was small, poorly equipped, and fully occupied with internal conflicts. The idea that Mexico could conquer Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona was fantasy. The United States was vastly more powerful militarily and economically than Mexico. Any Mexican invasion would be crushed quickly. Moreover, the Mexican government had no interest in this plan. Mexican President Venustiano Carranza, when eventually approached with this idea, rejected it immediately. He knew it was suicidal. He had no desire to provoke war with America. Mexico needed peace with America, not war. The whole scheme was based on a complete misunderstanding of Mexican capabilities and interests, but Zimmerman sent the telegram anyway. He used the most secure code Germany had. He sent it through multiple channels to ensure it reached Mexico. He even had the telegram routed through American diplomatic cables to avoid British interception, ironically using American cooperation to send a message plotting against America. But British intelligence intercepted it anyway. Britain controlled undersea telegraph cables and monitored all communications crossing the Atlantic. The British had a secret intelligence operation called Room 40, which specialized in decoding German messages. British codebreakers had been intercepting and reading German diplomatic and military communications throughout the war. When the Zimmerman telegram came through, Room 40 intercepted it and worked on decoding it. It took them some time because the German code was complex. But British cryptographers, including the famous codebreaker Reverend William Montgomery, broke the code and read the telegram. When they understood what it said, they were shocked and then delighted. This was exactly what Britain needed to bring America into the war. A German plot to attack America, to give American territory to Mexico, was the perfect propaganda tool to turn American public opinion decisively against Germany. But Britain had a problem. If they just handed the decoded telegram to America, Germany would know Britain had broken their codes, Germany would change their codes, and Britain would lose this valuable intelligence source. Britain needed a way to reveal the telegram to America without revealing how they got it. British intelligence came up with a clever solution. They knew the telegram had been sent to Mexico City. They had agents in Mexico who might be able to get a copy of the telegram from the German embassy there. If they could get the Mexican copy, they could claim they got the telegram from Mexico, not from intercepting it in transit. This would protect their code-breaking secret. British agents in Mexico City managed to obtain a copy of the telegram from a source in the Mexican telegraph office. Now, Britain could reveal the telegram without compromising their intelligence operation. In late February 1917, British intelligence approached the American ambassador in London and gave him the Zimmerman telegram. American officials were initially skeptical. Was this real, or was it British propaganda designed to manipulate America into the war? The telegram seemed almost too perfect, too outrageous to be genuine, but the British provided evidence that it was real, including details about how they obtained it. Wilson received the telegram and had American intelligence verify its authenticity. They confirmed it was real. Wilson sat on it for a few days, trying to decide what to do. He knew that releasing the telegram publicly would enrage Americans and make war almost inevitable. He was still hoping for some way to avoid war, but he also knew that Germany was sinking American ships and that something had to be done. On March 1, 1917, Wilson released the Zimmerman telegram to the press. American newspapers printed it the next day. The reaction was explosive. Americans were shocked and furious. Germany was plotting with Mexico to invade America. Germany was trying to give American territory to Mexico. Germany was treating America as an enemy, even while America was still technically neutral. This was outrageous. This made everything personal. Before, the war was about Europeans killing each other far away. Americans could debate whether America had any stake in European conflicts. But now, Germany was directly threatening American territory. Germany was plotting attacks on American soil. This wasn't about defending Belgium or Britain. This was about defending Texas and New Mexico and Arizona. This was about defending America itself. The Zimmerman telegram turned American public opinion decisively toward war. Even people who had been strongly anti-war started changing their minds. Even German Americans found it hard to defend Germany's actions. Even isolationists had trouble arguing that America could stay out when Germany was actively plotting against America. The telegram made it clear that Germany saw America as an enemy, not as a neutral. And if Germany saw America as an enemy, maybe America needed to act like one. And then Zimmerman made an incredible mistake that confirmed the telegram's authenticity beyond any doubt. When questioned about the telegram by journalists, instead of denying it or calling it a forgery, Zimmerman admitted it was real. On March 3rd, he publicly acknowledged that he had sent the telegram. He defended it as a defensive measure, saying it was only meant to take effect if America entered the war. But his admission eliminated any doubt. The telegram was real. Germany had really proposed this plot. Even skeptics who thought it might be British propaganda had to accept that it was genuine. This admission was baffling. Why would Zimmerman confirm something that was turning American opinion against Germany? Maybe he thought honesty was the best policy. Maybe he didn't understand how badly it would play in America. Maybe he was incompetent. Whatever the reason, his admission sealed the deal. America was going to war. German U-boats made things even worse by continuing to sink American merchant ships in March 1917. The city of Memphis was sunk on March 17th. The Illinois was sunk on March 18th. The Vigilancia was sunk on March 16th. Americans died in these attacks. Every sinking created more outrage, more demands for war, more pressure on Wilson. Wilson spent late March agonizing over the decision. He knew that once America entered the war, nothing would ever be the same. America would be committing to a massive military effort. American soldiers would die by the thousands. The country would be mobilized for total war. The economy would be reorganized, civil liberties would be restricted, and there was no guarantee America could actually make a difference or achieve Wilson's idealistic goals for the post-war world. Wilson was torn between his desire for peace and his sense that Germany had left him no choice. There was one more factor that made Wilson more willing to go to war: the Russian Revolution. In March 1917, revolution overthrew Tsar Nicholas II. Russia had been an autocratic monarchy, one of the most repressive governments in Europe. Wilson had been uncomfortable with the idea of fighting alongside Tsarist Russia. How could he claim America was fighting for democracy when one of its allies was a dictatorship? But the March Revolution changed this. Russia was now led by a provisional government that promised to establish democracy, hold elections, and create a constitutional government. Russia was supposedly becoming democratic. This made it easier for Wilson to frame American intervention as a fight for democracy. He could argue that Britain, France, and now Russia were democracies fighting against the autocratic empires of Germany and Austria-Hungary. He could present the war as a struggle between democracy and autocracy, between freedom and militarism. He could give the war a moral purpose beyond just defending American ships or economic interests. This made war more palatable to Wilson personally and more marketable to the American public. On April 2, 1917, Wilson went before Congress to ask them to declare war on Germany. It was evening. The Capitol was packed with congressmen, senators, Supreme Court justices, cabinet members, and spectators. Wilson gave one of the most famous speeches in American history. He reviewed the history of German submarine warfare and the violations of American rights. He talked about the Zimmermann telegram and Germany's plots against America. He argued that Germany's actions showed it was waging war against all mankind, not just against its declared enemies. Then Wilson made his moral argument. He said America wasn't fighting for conquest or domination. America was fighting for principles. The world must be made safe for democracy, he said. America would fight to vindicate the rights of nations to choose their own way of life and government. America would fight for the rights of small nations against aggression. America would fight for international law and justice. America would fight to end the kind of militaristic autocracy that had started this war. America would be fighting a war to end all wars. It was beautiful, soaring rhetoric. Wilson genuinely believed what he was saying. He saw American intervention as a moral crusade. America wasn't just another power joining a war for selfish reasons. America was going to fight for universal principles that would benefit all humanity. American soldiers would be fighting for democracy, for freedom, for justice, for peace. Their sacrifice would create a new world order where wars would be settled by negotiation and international law, not by force. The speech was also politically brilliant. Wilson was selling the war to different audiences. To idealists, he offered a moral crusade for democracy and peace. To pragmatists, he offered the argument that Germany's actions had made war necessary to defend American rights and interests. To isolationists, he offered the promise that this war would end all future wars. So, America wouldn't have to keep fighting. There was something for everyone in Wilson's framing, but the speech was also somewhat hypocritical. Wilson presented America as having no selfish motives, as fighting purely for principles. This ignored the billions of dollars American banks had loaned to the Allies and would lose if the Allies lost. It ignored the massive profits American businesses were making from selling to the Allies. It ignored the economic interests that had shaped American neutrality from the beginning. It ignored Wilson's own pro-British sympathies and his administration's tilt toward the Allies. The high-minded talk about democracy was partly genuine, but it was also useful propaganda to rally the country and justify a war that had complex economic and strategic motivations. Congress debated for 4 days. There was opposition, though it was a minority. Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin gave a passionate speech against the war. He argued that America was being manipulated by bankers and industrialists who wanted to protect their profits and their loans to the Allies. He said Wilson was leading America into a pointless bloodbath that would kill Americans and destroy liberties at home. He pointed out that the majority of Americans, if given a chance to vote directly on war, would probably vote against it. He argued that Congress was defying the will of the people by voting for war. Senator George Norris of Nebraska also spoke against the war. He argued that America was going to war to protect the profits of munitions makers and bankers, not to defend democracy. He said the war had nothing to do with American security or American principles. It was about money and power, dressed up in noble language. Representative Jeanette Rankin of Montana, the first woman elected to Congress, voted against war. She was a pacifist who opposed all war on principle. Several other representatives and senators joined them in voting no, but the majority voted for war. In the Senate, the vote was 82-6 in favor of war. In the House, it was 373-50. On April 6, 1917, Wilson signed the Declaration. America was officially at war with Germany. The decision that would change American history and world history was made. There was no going back now. The American public response was mixed. There was a surge of patriotism in many places. Young men rushed to recruiting offices to enlist. Thousands volunteered in the first weeks. Propaganda posters went up everywhere. James Montgomery Flagg's famous "I Want You for U.S. Army" poster with Uncle Sam pointing became one of the most iconic images in American history. It was modeled on a British recruiting poster but became distinctively American. George M. Cohan wrote "Over There," a marching song about American soldiers going to fight in Europe. The lyrics promised the Yanks were coming and wouldn't come back until it was over there. The song became a huge hit and a rallying cry. There were parades and rallies in support of the war. Women volunteered for the Red Cross and other service organizations. People bought war bonds to finance the war effort. There was a genuine sense in many communities that America was embarking on a great crusade, that American soldiers would save democracy and end the war quickly. The propaganda presented it as an adventure, a chance to prove American courage and strength, but there was also significant opposition and reluctance. Socialists opposed the war as a capitalist conflict that would send working-class men to die for the profits of the rich. The Socialist Party held an emergency convention and voted to oppose the war. Socialist newspapers denounced the war as imperialist and called for workers to resist. Eugene V. Debs, the Socialist Party leader who had run for president 5 times, continued speaking against the war even after it was declared. Many German Americans opposed the war, or at least felt conflicted about fighting against Germany. German American communities had maintained strong cultural ties to Germany. They had German-language newspapers, churches, schools, and social clubs. They celebrated German culture and traditions. Now, America was declaring war on Germany, and German Americans were being asked to fight against their ancestral homeland. Some refused. Some tried to avoid the draft. Many felt torn between loyalty to America and sympathy for Germany. Irish Americans were also conflicted. They hated Britain because of British rule in Ireland. The Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916 had been brutally suppressed by the British, with leaders executed and thousands imprisoned. Irish Americans had been sending money and support to Irish independence movements. Now, America was being asked to fight alongside Britain. Many Irish Americans opposed this. They didn't want to help Britain, even if it meant fighting Germany. Pacifists opposed all war on principle. Religious groups like Quakers and Mennonites believed war was morally wrong and refused to participate. Some young men refused to register for the draft or refused to serve when drafted. They were called conscientious objectors. Some were respected and given alternative service. Others were harassed, arrested, and imprisoned. The opposition was strong enough that the government felt the need to suppress it aggressively. The Espionage Act was passed in June 1917. This law made it illegal to interfere with military recruitment or to cause disloyalty in the armed forces. The penalties were severe, up to 20 years in prison. The law was used to prosecute people who spoke out against the war, who criticized the draft, who distributed anti-war literature. Over 2,000 people were prosecuted under the Espionage Act during the war. The Sedition Act was passed in May 1918, expanding the Espionage Act. This law made it illegal to say anything disloyal, profane, or abusive about the government, the flag, the Constitution, or the military. It was illegal to speak against the war in any way that might undermine support for it. This was a massive restriction on free speech, far beyond anything that would be tolerated today, but the government argued it was necessary during wartime to maintain national unity and morale. Eugene Debs was arrested in June 1918 for giving a speech in Canton, Ohio, in which he criticized the war and the draft. He was convicted under the Espionage Act and sentenced to 10 years in prison. He was 63 years old. He ran for president from his prison cell in 1920 and received nearly 1 million votes. He was finally pardoned and released in 1921 by President Harding, but his imprisonment showed how far the government would go to suppress dissent. Newspapers were shut down if they printed anti-war articles. The Postmaster General was given authority to refuse to mail any publication that opposed the war. Socialist and radical newspapers were banned from the mail, which effectively put them out of business since mailing was how they reached readers. Foreign language newspapers, especially German language papers, were censored or shut down. Editors were arrested. Presses were destroyed. The government created a Committee on Public Information, headed by George Creel, to manage propaganda and information. Creel's committee produced posters, films, pamphlets, and speakers to promote the war and demonize Germany. German Americans faced discrimination and persecution. Speaking German in public could get you harassed or even arrested in some places. German language was banned in schools in many states. Iowa banned speaking German in public entirely, even on the telephone or in church. German American organizations were shut down or forced to dissolve. German American newspapers were shut down. People with German names sometimes changed them to sound more American. Schmidt became Smith. Muller became Miller. German foods were renamed. Sauerkraut became Liberty cabbage. Hamburgers became Liberty sandwiches. Dachshunds were called Liberty pups. It was absurd, but it showed the hysteria and the pressure to prove loyalty by rejecting anything German. There were violent attacks on German Americans. In April 1918, a German-American man named Robert Prager was lynched by a mob in Collinsville, Illinois. He was accused of making disloyal statements about America. A mob dragged him from his home, forced him to kiss the American flag, wrapped him in an American flag, and hanged him. The men who killed him were tried for murder and acquitted. The jury decided they were patriots, not criminals. This sent a message that violence against German Americans would be tolerated or even celebrated. The suppression of dissent and the persecution of German Americans are dark chapters in American history. They show how wartime hysteria can lead to violations of civil liberties and human rights. The government justified these actions as necessary for national security and winning the war, but they were excessive and unjust, targeting people simply for their ethnicity or for exercising free speech. It's a reminder that even democracies can become repressive during wartime if citizens don't defend civil liberties. Now, here's the reality about America entering the war. America wasn't ready to fight, not even close. The Army in April 1917 had about 130,000 men, barely larger than it had been in 1914. The National Guard added maybe another 70,000. That's 200,000 men total, counting everyone. France and Britain each had armies of millions. Germany had millions. Russia had millions. America's contribution would be tiny unless it could massively expand its military. Congress passed the Selective Service Act in May 1917, which established a draft. All men aged 21 to 30 had to register. Later, this was expanded to ages 18 to 45. About 24 million men registered over the course of the war. Local draft boards decided who would be drafted and who would get exemptions for health, family reasons, or essential civilian work. About 2.8 million men were drafted during the war. Another 2 million volunteered. By the end of the war, America had about 4 million men in uniform, though not all of them saw combat. Many were support troops working in logistics, transportation, medical services, and other non-combat roles. But training and equipping 4 million men took time. New military bases had to be built. Training camps were constructed all over the country. Men were brought to these camps and put through basic training. They learned to march, to drill, to shoot, to follow orders. They were introduced to military discipline and military life. For many young men from farms and small towns, it was their first time away from home, their first time seeing people from different parts of the country, their first exposure to modern military organization. The training was rushed. America needed troops in Europe as soon as possible. Training that might normally take a year was compressed into months or even weeks. Men learned the basics, but often weren't fully prepared for the realities of combat. They didn't understand trench warfare. They didn't know about poison gas. They didn't know about the psychological impact of artillery bombardments. They would have to learn on the job, and some would die because of inadequate training. Equipping the troops was another huge challenge. America didn't have enough rifles, uniforms, helmets, boots, or any of the other equipment soldiers needed. American industry had to shift to war production. Factories that made civilian goods started making military supplies. The government placed massive orders for weapons, ammunition, uniforms, and equipment. But production took time to ramp up. In the meantime, American soldiers trained with wooden rifles because there weren't enough real ones. They wore old uniforms from the Spanish-American War. They used British and French equipment when they got to Europe because American equipment wasn't available yet. American industry eventually performed remarkably well. By late 1917 and into 1918, American factories were producing vast quantities of war materials. The United States became the arsenal of democracy, producing not just for American forces but also supplying the Allies. American steel production, oil production, and food production increased dramatically. American shipyards built hundreds of ships to replace those sunk by U-boats and to transport troops to Europe. American railroads were nationalized and coordinated to ensure efficient movement of supplies. The entire economy was mobilized for war. Getting soldiers to Europe was a huge logistical challenge. German U-boats were still operating in the Atlantic, sinking ships regularly. Troop ships crossing the Atlantic were vulnerable to submarine attack. Thousands of soldiers on a single ship made a tempting target. The U.S. Navy had to work closely with the British Navy to protect convoys crossing the Atlantic. The convoy system, where merchant ships and troop ships traveled together protected by destroyers and other warships, proved effective at reducing losses to submarines. Destroyers could detect submarines with listening devices and attack them with depth charges. The convoy system didn't eliminate submarine attacks, but it made them much less effective. Even with convoy protection, crossing the Atlantic was dangerous and unpleasant. The voyage took about 2 weeks. Soldiers were packed into ships with minimal space and amenities. Seasickness was common. The threat of submarine attack was constant. Men slept in bunks stacked several high. The food was bad. The conditions were cramped and uncomfortable. For many young men, it was their first time on a ship, their first time crossing an ocean, their first time leaving America. It must have been terrifying and exciting at the same time. The first significant American troops, called the American Expeditionary Forces, or AEF, arrived in France in June 1917. The commander was General John J. Pershing. Pershing was chosen because he had extensive combat experience. He had fought in the Spanish-American War, in the Philippines against insurgents, and had led the expedition into Mexico chasing Pancho Villa. He was tough, disciplined, and didn't tolerate nonsense. He was known as Black Jack Pershing, a nickname that came from his service commanding African-American troops, the Buffalo Soldiers, earlier in his career. Pershing had strong ideas about how American forces should be used. He insisted that American troops would fight as a separate, independent American army under American command. He didn't want American units absorbed into British and French armies as replacements for their losses. He wanted Americans to fight together under the American flag, preserving American identity and American control. This caused tension with British and French commanders, who desperately needed reinforcements immediately and didn't want to wait for America to build up a separate army. They argued that American troops should be fed into existing British and French divisions to strengthen them and get Americans into combat faster. Pershing refused. He argued that America hadn't entered the war just to provide cannon fodder for British and French generals. American troops would fight as Americans, not as auxiliaries for other armies. Pershing also believed, somewhat arrogantly, that American fighting spirit and tactics would be superior to the defensive, trench-bound approach that had developed in Europe. He thought American troops, with their initiative and aggression, would break the stalemate. He was partially right, but also underestimated the difficulty of modern warfare. Wilson backed Pershing on this. American troops would form their own army and fight independently. This meant it would take longer to get Americans into combat because they had to build up sufficient numbers first. But it preserved American autonomy and ensured that American sacrifices would be clearly American, not hidden in British or French casualty lists. This mattered politically. Americans needed to see that their troops were making a distinct contribution, not just being used as replacements by other countries. American troops weren't ready for significant combat in 1917. They needed training. Some American units were assigned to train with experienced French and British units. American soldiers spent time in quieter sectors of the front, learning about trench warfare under the guidance of Allied veterans. They learned about living in trenches. They learned about rotating between frontline positions, support positions, and rest areas. They learned about dealing with mud, rats, lice, and the constant threat of artillery and sniper fire. They learned about going over the top and attacking across no man's land. They learned about poison gas and how to use gas masks. They learned about the realities of modern warfare that were very different from anything they had trained for in America. It wouldn't be until early 1918 that American forces would start fighting in significant numbers. But just the promise of American troops had an enormous psychological effect. British and French soldiers who had been fighting for over 3 years and were exhausted, demoralized, and depleted took heart knowing that millions of fresh American soldiers were coming. The Americans were eager, enthusiastic, well-fed, and full of energy. They represented hope that the war could still be won. French civilians cheered American troops marching through their towns. The phrase "Lafayette, we are here" became famous, a reference to the Marquis de Lafayette who had helped America during the Revolutionary War. Now, Americans were repaying the debt, coming to help France in its hour of need. On the German side, the reaction was very different. German soldiers and civilians, already worn down by years of war and the effects of the British blockade, were demoralized by the knowledge that they would soon face a new enemy with seemingly unlimited resources. Germany had been hoping to win before America could intervene. Now, time was running out. Germany needed to win quickly, or the weight of American power would crush them. The timing of American entry was crucial for the overall outcome of the war. In 1917, the Allies were in serious trouble. France had suffered massive casualties in failed offensives in 1917. The Nivelle Offensive in April and May 1917 was supposed to break through German lines and end the war. Instead, it failed completely with enormous French casualties. French soldiers had been promised this would be the final offensive. That success was certain. When it failed, French morale collapsed. Mutinies broke out across the French army. Soldiers refused to attack. They were willing to defend but not to participate in more suicidal offensives. French generals had to execute some mutineers to restore discipline, but they also had to stop launching major attacks for months. The French army was on the edge of collapse in mid-1917. Britain was exhausted. The Battle of Passchendaele from July to November 1917 was another British offensive that gained almost nothing at a cost of hundreds of thousands of casualties. British soldiers fought through mud so deep that men and horses drowned in it. The offensive accomplished virtually nothing except adding to the casualty list. British morale was low. British society was tired of the war. Italy was struggling. Italian forces fighting Austria-Hungary had made little progress. In October 1917, the Battle of Caporetto was a disaster for Italy. Austro-Hungarian and German forces broke through Italian lines. Italian soldiers retreated in chaos. Over 300,000 Italians were killed, wounded, or captured. Italy nearly dropped out of the war. British and French forces had to be sent to Italy to help stabilize the situation. And in November 1917, Russia dropped out of the war entirely. The Bolshevik Revolution overthrew the provisional government. The Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, had promised to end Russia's participation in the war. They kept that promise. They immediately began peace negotiations with Germany. By March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and officially left the war. This was a disaster for the Allies because it freed up hundreds of thousands of German soldiers to transfer from the Eastern Front to the Western Front. Germany could now concentrate all its forces in the West for one final push to win the war before. American troops arrived in force. Germany launched a massive spring offensive starting in March 1918. This was called the Ludendorff Offensive, or the Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. General Erich Ludendorff, who was effectively running Germany's war effort by this point, planned a series of massive attacks along the Western Front. The goal was to break through Allied lines, separate the British and French armies, capture key positions, and force the Allies to negotiate before American troops could make a difference. The offensive initially succeeded beyond German expectations. On March 21, 1918, German forces attacked along a 50-mile front near the Somme River. Using new tactics involving infiltration by stormtroopers, short but intense artillery bombardments, and exploitation of weak points, German forces broke through British lines. They advanced rapidly, covering more ground in days than either side had gained in years of previous fighting. Allied forces fell back. For a moment, it looked like Germany might actually win. Paris was threatened. The French government prepared to evacuate. Panic spread through the Allied ranks, but the offensive eventually ran out of steam. German forces had advanced too far, too fast, and they outran their supplies. The logistics couldn't keep up. German soldiers, who had been living on short rations for years due to the blockade, stopped to loot Allied supply dumps instead of continuing the advance. German casualties were heavy. The offensive had created a bulge in the Allied lines but hadn't achieved a decisive breakthrough. By April, the offensive had stalled. Germany launched more attacks in April, May, and June, trying to finish the job. Each attack initially succeeded, but then stalled. Each attack cost Germany casualties it couldn't afford to replace. Germany was burning through its manpower reserves, throwing everything into these offensives. By summer 1918, Germany had shot its bolt. The offensives had failed to win the war. Germany had taken heavy losses, and American troops were finally arriving in large numbers. By summer 1918, over 1 million American soldiers were in France, with more arriving every month. The rate of American troop arrivals reached over 250,000 per month by mid-1918. American troops fought in several major battles in 1918 that helped turn the tide of the war. The Battle of Belleau Wood in June 1918 was one of the first major American engagements. U.S. Marines fought German forces in a dense forest. The fighting was brutal in close quarters. Marines attacked German machine gun positions repeatedly, taking heavy casualties. The battle lasted nearly a month. When it was over, the Marines had driven the Germans out but had suffered over 9,000 casualties, about half their strength. But they had proven that American troops could fight effectively against veteran German soldiers. The Marines earned a reputation for toughness and ferocity. German intelligence reports started referring to the Marines as devil dogs, though the story may be exaggerated. The Battle of Château-Thierry in July 1918 saw American and French forces stop a German advance toward Paris. American troops dug in and held their positions against repeated German attacks. The Germans couldn't break through. This was psychologically important because it showed that American troops could stop the Germans and wouldn't break under pressure. The Saint-Mihiel offensive in September 1918 was the first major American-led operation. Over 500,000 American troops, supported by French forces, attacked a German salient near the town of Saint-Mihiel. The attack succeeded in eliminating the salient in just a few days. American forces captured over 15,000 German prisoners and 450 guns. It was a clear American victory that boosted confidence and showed that American forces could conduct large-scale offensive operations. The Meuse-Argonne offensive, which lasted from September 26 to November 11, 1918, was the largest American battle of the war. Over 1.2 million American soldiers participated. The goal was to break through German defenses in the Argonne Forest and the Meuse River Valley, cut German railway supply lines, and force a German retreat. The terrain was difficult, heavily forested and hilly. German defenses were strong, with multiple lines of trenches, barbed wire, machine guns, and artillery. The offensive was costly. American forces suffered over 120,000 casualties, making it the deadliest battle in American history until World War II. American troops made mistakes due to inexperience. Attacks sometimes got bogged down, units got lost in the forest. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and tanks was imperfect. But American troops kept pushing forward. They ground through German defenses by sheer weight of numbers and determination. The offensive helped convince Germany that they couldn't win. German lines were being pushed back. German reserves were exhausted. It was only a matter of time before German defenses collapsed entirely. American troops were inexperienced compared to British, French, and German veterans. They made tactical mistakes. They took heavier casualties than more experienced troops might have in the same situations. American tactics were sometimes outdated. Pershing emphasized aggressive, open warfare tactics, believing in attacking spirit and individual initiative. This was a reaction against the defensive, trench-bound warfare that had characterized the conflict. But modern warfare required coordinated attacks using infantry, artillery, machine guns, tanks, and aircraft working together. American forces learned these lessons on the battlefield, sometimes at a high cost. But what American troops lacked in experience, they made up for in enthusiasm, energy, and numbers. They were fresh. They hadn't spent 3 years in the trenches being worn down by constant combat. They were well-fed, unlike German soldiers who were suffering from malnutrition. They had good equipment, or at least adequate equipment once American production ramped up. They had high morale because they believed they were fighting for a noble cause, and most importantly, they kept coming. Every month, hundreds of thousands more Americans arrived in France. Germany couldn't match this. Germany was running out of men. Every casualty Germany took was irreplaceable. Every casualty America took could be replaced with fresh troops from home. This numerical advantage was decisive. By fall 1918, the Allies had clear numerical superiority on the Western Front. American troops gave them the edge they needed. German forces were exhausted. The spring offensive had cost Germany dearly. German morale was collapsing. Soldiers knew they were losing. The civilian population in Germany was starving and desperate. The political situation was unstable. By autumn 1918, Germany's allies were surrendering one by one. Bulgaria quit the war in September 1918, signing an armistice after Allied forces broke through in the Balkans. The Ottoman Empire signed an armistice on October 30, 1918, after British forces captured Syria and Palestine and threatened Constantinople. Austria-Hungary was disintegrating as different ethnic groups declared independence. The empire signed an armistice on November 3, 1918, and within days the empire ceased to exist as a functioning state. Germany was alone, facing enemies on all sides, with no way to continue fighting. The German Navy mutinied in late October 1918. Sailors at the naval base in Kiel refused orders to launch a final suicidal attack on the British fleet. The mutiny spread to other ports and cities. Workers joined the sailors in revolt. Revolutionary councils took control of cities. It looked like Germany might have a revolution like Russia. The German government was losing control. On November 9, 1918, Kaiser Wilhelm II abdicated and fled to the Netherlands. A republic was proclaimed. The new government immediately sought an armistice. German representatives met with Allied commanders in a railway car in the forest of Compiègne in France. The Allies presented armistice terms that were harsh. Germany had to withdraw from all occupied territories. Germany had to surrender massive amounts of military equipment. Allied forces would occupy German territory west of the Rhine River. But the terms weren't as harsh as unconditional surrender. The armistice was presented as an agreement to stop fighting, not a total capitulation. On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the armistice took effect. After 4 years, 3 months, and 1 week, the fighting stopped. The war was over. Germany had lost. The Allies had won. An American intervention had been decisive in that victory. Without American troops, the outcome might have been very different. Britain and France were exhausted by 1917. If America hadn't entered the war, they might have been forced to accept a negotiated peace, probably on terms favorable to Germany. Germany's spring offensive in 1918 might have succeeded in breaking the Allied lines if American troops hadn't been arriving to reinforce them. Or the war might have dragged on for years longer, killing even more millions, until both sides were so exhausted they had to stop. American intervention didn't just help the Allies win, it ensured a decisive Allied victory by late 1918, ending the war sooner than it might otherwise have ended. American casualties were significant but much lower than European casualties. About 116,000 American soldiers died during the war. Roughly 53,000 died in combat or from combat wounds. Another 63,000 died from disease, primarily from the Spanish flu pandemic that hit in 1918 and killed millions worldwide. The military camps where American soldiers trained and lived were perfect breeding grounds for the flu. Men from all over the country brought different strains of disease, and they lived in close quarters. The disease spread rapidly. Many soldiers died from the flu before they ever got to Europe. About 204,000 Americans were wounded in the war. These numbers are substantial. Every death was a tragedy for the families involved. Every wounded soldier carried physical and psychological scars. But compared to European losses, American casualties were relatively light. France lost over 1.4 million soldiers killed. Britain lost about 900,000. Germany lost about 2 million. Russia lost over 3 million, though exact numbers are hard to determine. Italy lost over 600,000. Austria-Hungary lost over 1 million. The Ottoman Empire lost over 700,000 soldiers. America fought for less than 2 years, from April 1917 to November 1918. Europeans had been fighting for over 4 years. American troops were fresh and well supplied while European armies were worn down. This explains the disparity in casualties. But the consequences of American intervention went far beyond the military contribution to winning the war. American entry into World War I fundamentally changed America's role in the world. Before 1917, America was a major economic power, but avoided involvement in European political and military affairs. America had interests in Latin America and the Pacific, but stayed out of European alliances and conflicts. This was the policy of isolation or non-entanglement that went back to George Washington. After 1917, this changed permanently. America became a major player in global politics. American military power had been demonstrated. American economic power had proven decisive in determining the outcome of the war. American soldiers had fought in Europe and won. America could no longer pretend to be separate from European affairs. The world was too interconnected. What happened in Europe affected America. What America did affected the world. American intervention ensured Allied victory. An Allied victory meant that the winners got to write the terms of the peace. The Treaty of Versailles and the other peace treaties that ended the war were shaped by the Allies, with significant American input through President Wilson. But these treaties, particularly Versailles, created problems that would lead to future conflicts. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, was harsh on Germany. Germany had to accept full responsibility for starting the war through the War Guilt Clause, Article 231. This was humiliating, and most Germans didn't accept it. Germany had to pay enormous reparations to compensate the Allies for war damages. The amount was set at 132 billion gold marks, a sum so large Germany couldn't possibly pay it. Germany lost territory to France, Poland, Belgium, Denmark, and Lithuania. Germany lost all its colonies. The German military was severely restricted. The army was limited to 100,000 men. Germany couldn't have tanks, aircraft, or submarines. The Rhineland was demilitarized. The treaty was designed to ensure Germany could never threaten its neighbors again. But it was too harsh to be accepted by Germans as fair, and not harsh enough to actually prevent German recovery. It created massive resentment in Germany without creating real security for Germany's neighbors. Germans felt humiliated and betrayed. They called the treaty a diktat, a dictated peace forced on them. The War Guilt Clause was particularly offensive. Most Germans believed they had fought a defensive war. The reparations seemed designed to destroy Germany economically. The territorial losses were painful, especially the creation of the Polish corridor which separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany. This resentment would be exploited by extremist politicians in Germany, particularly Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party. Hitler rose to power in the 1930s by promising to overturn the Treaty of Versailles, restore German honor, and make Germany strong again. He blamed Germany's problems on the treaty and on the democratic politicians who had signed it. Many Germans, still bitter about Versailles, listened. The harsh, but not harsh enough peace created conditions that would lead to World War II just 20 years later. If America had stayed out of World War I, the war might have ended in a negotiated stalemate. Germany wouldn't have been so thoroughly defeated. The peace treaty might have been more moderate, more acceptable to Germany. Germany might not have felt so humiliated and resentful. Hitler might never have risen to power. World War II might never have happened. Obviously, we can't know this for certain. History doesn't have control groups. We can't rerun the experiment with different variables. But it's plausible that American intervention, while winning World War I, helped create conditions for an even worse war. American intervention also meant that President Wilson got to participate in the Paris Peace Conference and push for his vision of post-war order. Wilson arrived in Europe in December 1918 and received a hero's welcome. Crowds lined the streets in Paris, London, and Rome cheering for him. Europeans saw Wilson as the man who had saved them, the leader who represented hope for a just peace. Wilson's 14 points, which he had outlined in a speech in January 1918, offered a vision of a new world order based on democracy, self-determination, open diplomacy, free trade, disarmament, and collective security through a League of Nations. Wilson's 14 points included specific proposals. The first 5 were general principles: open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, arms reduction, and adjustment of colonial claims with consideration for the people living in those territories. Points 6 through 13 dealt with specific territorial issues: evacuation of occupied territories, restoration of Belgium, return of Alsace-Lorraine to France, adjustment of Italy's borders, autonomy for ethnic groups in Austria, Hungary, restoration of Romania and Serbia, self-determination for peoples of the Ottoman Empire, restoration of Poland. The 14th point called for creation of a League of Nations to guarantee political independence and territorial integrity of nations, and to prevent future wars through collective security. Wilson was idealistic. He genuinely believed that World War I could be the war to end all wars if the peace was structured correctly. He thought that replacing autocratic empires with democracies, giving people self-determination, creating international institutions for cooperation, and establishing rules-based international order would prevent future conflicts. It was a noble vision. But it was also naive and impractical in many ways. At the Paris Peace Conference, Wilson's vision was compromised. The other major leaders, particularly Georges Clemenceau of France and David Lloyd George of Britain, had different priorities. Clemenceau wanted to punish Germany and ensure France's security. He had lived through 2 German invasions of France in 1870 and 1914. He wanted Germany weakened so thoroughly that it could never threaten France again. Lloyd George wanted to protect British interests, maintain the British Empire, and ensure British naval supremacy. Neither was particularly interested in Wilson's idealistic vision if it conflicted with their national interests. The negotiations were difficult. Wilson had to compromise on many of his points. The treaty was harsher on Germany than Wilson wanted. The principle of self-determination was applied inconsistently. It was used to break up Austria-Hungary and create new nation-states in Eastern Europe, but it wasn't applied to German-speaking populations who wanted to join Germany but were prevented from doing so. It wasn't applied to colonial peoples in Africa and Asia who wanted independence. Britain and France kept their empires and even expanded them by taking German colonies and Ottoman territories. Self-determination apparently only applied to Europeans, and even then, only when it was convenient. Wilson did get his League of Nations. The League Covenant was included as the first part of the Treaty of Versailles. Wilson considered this his greatest achievement. He believed the League would be able to correct any injustices in the treaty over time and would prevent future wars. The League would provide a forum for nations to resolve disputes peacefully. It would coordinate international cooperation on issues like health, labor standards, and humanitarian relief. It would organize collective security, where member nations would unite against any aggressor. Wilson saw the League as the foundation of a new world order. But the League had a fatal weakness. The United States didn't join. When Wilson returned to America with the Treaty of Versailles, he faced opposition in the Senate. The Senate had to ratify the treaty with a two-thirds majority for it to take effect. Many senators opposed the treaty, particularly Article 10 of the League Covenant, which committed member nations to defend each other against aggression. Senators worried this would obligate America to fight in foreign wars without congressional approval. They wanted to preserve American sovereignty and congressional power to declare war. The opposition was led by Senator Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts, who was Wilson's political rival. Lodge wasn't necessarily opposed to international cooperation, but he wanted reservations added to the treaty to protect American interests and constitutional procedures. Wilson refused to accept any reservations. He saw them as weakening the treaty and betraying his vision. He believed the treaty had to be accepted as written or not at all. Wilson tried to rally public support by taking a speaking tour across the country. In September 1919, he gave speeches in dozens of cities explaining the treaty and the League. But the tour exhausted him. Wilson suffered a severe stroke on October 2, 1919, that left him partially paralyzed and unable to perform his duties effectively. His wife, Edith, essentially ran the White House for the remaining 17 months of his presidency, controlling access to Wilson and making decisions in his name. This was kept secret from the public and even from most government officials. The Senate voted on the treaty twice, in November 1919 and March 1920. Both times, it failed to get the two-thirds majority needed for ratification. The treaty with Wilson's version was rejected. The treaty with reservations was also rejected because Wilson had instructed his supporters to vote against it rather than accept reservations. The result was that America never joined the League of Nations. The organization Wilson had fought so hard to create was launched without its primary sponsor. This crippled the League from the start. The League of Nations without American participation was weak and ineffective. America was the world's largest economy and potentially the most powerful military force. Without America, the League lacked the power to enforce its decisions. Britain and France dominated the League, but they were exhausted from the war and reluctant to commit resources to collective security. The League had no military force of its own. It relied on member nations to provide troops if action was needed. But member nations were unwilling to fight for distant causes that didn't directly affect them. The League failed repeatedly in the 1920s and 1930s to prevent aggression. When Japan invaded Manchuria in 1931, the League condemned the action but did nothing to stop it. Japan simply withdrew from the League. When Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1935, the League imposed sanctions, but they were too weak to matter. Italy conquered Ethiopia. When Germany under Hitler began rearming in violation of Versailles, annexing Austria, and taking Czechoslovakia, the League did nothing. The League was supposed to prevent wars through collective security. Instead, it became a forum for making speeches that nobody listened to. The failure of the League meant that the international order created after World War I was unstable and couldn't be maintained. The treaties were unjust in many ways and created resentments. The League was supposed to provide a mechanism for peacefully adjusting those treaties and resolving disputes. Without an effective League, there was no such mechanism. Conflicts that might have been resolved through international cooperation instead escalated to violence. World War II broke out just 20 years after World War I ended, and World War II can be seen as a direct consequence of how World War I ended. The harsh Treaty of Versailles created conditions for Hitler's rise in Germany. The failure of the League of Nations meant there was no effective international mechanism to stop German, Italian, and Japanese aggression in the 1930s. The territorial settlements in Eastern Europe created by the peace treaties left ethnic minorities and border disputes that Hitler exploited. The division of the Middle East between Britain and France created instability and conflicts that continue today. If the peace after World War I had been structured differently, maybe World War II could have been avoided. If the treaty had been less harsh on Germany, if the League had included America and had real power, if self-determination had been applied consistently, if the victors had focused on creating a stable and just peace rather than punishing their enemies, maybe the world would have been more stable. But that's not what happened. American intervention in World War I won the war, but didn't win the peace. America helped defeat Germany, but then retreated back into relative isolationism. America refused to join the League of Nations. America didn't ratify the Treaty of Versailles and made a separate peace with Germany in 1921. America withdrew from European affairs in the 1920s, focusing on domestic prosperity and avoiding international commitments. This left Britain and France trying to maintain the peace settlement without American support. They couldn't do it effectively. American intervention in World War I also established a pattern that would repeat. America would stay out of international conflicts as long as possible, trying to remain neutral and avoid entanglement. But eventually, something would force America in, whether it was attacks on American ships, threats to American interests, or a sense that American security required involvement. Then America would intervene decisively, bringing its enormous economic and military power to bear, tipping the balance and helping to win the war. This happened again in World War II, when America stayed neutral until Pearl Harbor, then entered and helped win the war. This pattern reflects American ambivalence about the country's role in the world. Americans don't want to be the world's policemen. They don't want their sons dying in foreign wars. They want to focus on problems at home. But American interests are global. American trade depends on international stability. American security is affected by what happens abroad. So America gets pulled into conflicts reluctantly, fights them, then tries to go home and return to normal. But normal never quite comes back. Each intervention changes America and changes the world in ways that make future interventions more likely. World War I transformed American society as well as American foreign policy. The federal government grew enormously in size and power during the war. Government agencies were created to manage the war effort. The War Industries Board coordinated industrial production. The Food Administration managed food production and distribution. The Fuel Administration controlled coal and oil. The Railroad Administration took control of the railroads. The government was regulating the economy and controlling industries in ways that would have been unthinkable before the war. Some of this government expansion was temporary and was rolled back after the war, but some was permanent. The war established precedents for government intervention in the economy during emergencies. It showed that government could mobilize society and the economy for national purposes when necessary. These lessons would be applied again during the Great Depression and World War II, leading to permanent expansion of federal power. The war changed social patterns. Women entered the workforce in large numbers to replace men who had gone to war. They worked in factories, offices, farms, and various jobs that had previously been reserved for men. They drove ambulances, worked as nurses, and served in support roles for the military. This demonstrated that women could do jobs that men had claimed only men could do. After the war, women's contributions were recognized by finally granting them the right to vote. The 19th Amendment giving women suffrage was ratified in 1920. The war didn't cause the women's suffrage movement, which had been working for decades, but it accelerated its success. The war accelerated the great migration of Black Americans from the rural South to northern industrial cities. Southern Black Americans had faced discrimination, violence, and limited economic opportunities under segregation. When war industries in the North needed workers and white workers were going off to war, Black Americans moved north to take those jobs. Hundreds of thousands of Black Americans moved to cities like Chicago, Detroit, New York, and Philadelphia during and after the war. This changed the demographics of American cities and contributed to the development of Black urban communities and culture. It also led to racial tensions and conflicts, including race riots in several cities in 1919. The war changed American culture in subtle ways. Americans who served in Europe were exposed to European cultures. They saw different ways of living, different attitudes, different experiences. When they came home, they brought these experiences with them. This contributed to the cultural changes of the 1920s, the Jazz Age, the loosening of Victorian social restrictions, the questioning of traditional values. The war had shown that the old order could collapse. Traditional authority had led to catastrophe. Young people who had survived or grown up during the war were less willing to simply accept what they were told by their elders. The war also created disillusionment. Wilson had promised the war would make the world safe for democracy and would end all wars. It didn't. The peace settlement was flawed and unjust in many ways. The world didn't become safe for democracy. Within a few years, democracies were collapsing across Europe and being replaced by dictatorships. Fascism rose in Italy. Communism ruled in Russia. Authoritarian regimes took over in much of Eastern Europe. Democracy seemed to be in retreat, not advancing. The war to end all wars didn't end wars. Fighting continued in Russia, in the Middle East, in various parts of the world. And within 20 years, an even bigger and more destructive war would start. Americans who had believed Wilson's promises felt betrayed. They felt the sacrifices had been for nothing. American boys had died in France for what? To create an unstable peace that led to more war? This disillusionment contributed to American isolationism in the 1930s. Many Americans felt that intervening in World War I had been a mistake and were determined not to make that mistake again. But as Europe slid toward another war in the 1930s, Americans found that they couldn't simply ignore what was happening. When Germany under Hitler began rearming, when Japan invaded China, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, and when Spain descended into civil war, Americans watched nervously. Some argued America should help stop aggression before it was too late. Others argued America should stay out no matter what. The debate over intervention versus isolation dominated American politics in the late 1930s. Eventually, America was pulled into World War II, just as it had been pulled into World War I. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, made the decision for America. Japan's attack forced America into the war. Germany then declared war on America, bringing America into the European theater as well. Once again, America mobilized its vast resources, built a huge military, sent millions of soldiers overseas, and helped win the war. Once again, American intervention was decisive. But after World War II, unlike after World War I, America didn't retreat into isolationism. America stayed engaged in the world. America helped rebuild Europe through the Marshall Plan. America led the creation of the United Nations, a more effective successor to the League of Nations. America committed to defending Western Europe through NATO. America occupied and helped rebuild Japan and Germany. America became the leader of what was called the Free World in opposition to the Soviet Union and communism. This permanent engagement with the world, this role as global superpower and leader of the democratic world, traces back to the lessons learned from World War I and its aftermath. American leaders after World War II believed that America's retreat after World War I had been a mistake. They believed that if America had stayed engaged, had joined the League, had helped maintain the peace settlement, maybe World War II could have been prevented. So after World War II, America committed to staying engaged permanently. This is the world we still live in today. America as global superpower, with military bases around the world, alliances across the globe, commitments to defend dozens of countries, involvement in conflicts everywhere. This role has costs and benefits. America has helped prevent major wars between great powers for over 70 years. America has supported democracy and human rights in many places. American power has provided stability that allowed global trade and prosperity to flourish. But American interventions have also sometimes been counterproductive, supporting dictators, fighting wars that didn't serve American interests, creating resentment against America in many parts of the world. The question of what America's role in the world should be remains contentious. And it all traces back to that decision in April 1917. When Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, when America abandoned its tradition of staying out of European wars, when American soldiers went to fight in France, America began a transformation from regional power to global superpower. The decision to enter World War I changed everything. It changed the outcome of the war. It changed America's role in the world. It changed how Americans thought about themselves and their country's place in global affairs. It set in motion a chain of events that would shape the entire 20th century. Was it the right decision? That's impossible to answer definitively. If America had stayed out, the war might have ended differently, maybe better, maybe worse. Maybe Germany would have won. Maybe there would have been a negotiated peace. Maybe the war would have dragged on for years longer. We can't know. What we do know is that America entering the war helped the Allies win decisively by late 1918. And we know that the peace settlement that followed created problems that led to more wars. And we know that America's involvement in World War I marked the beginning of America's permanent role as a major player in global affairs. The tragedy is that American intervention, meant to end all wars and make the world safe for democracy, contributed to conditions for an even worse war just 2 decades later. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Wilson wanted lasting peace. He wanted to create a new world order based on justice and cooperation. He got 20 years of unstable peace, followed by the most destructive war in human history. Sometimes the consequences of our actions are the opposite of what we intended. Sometimes even well-meaning decisions lead to disasters we didn't foresee. America joined World War I to protect its interests, uphold its principles, and save democracy. In doing so, America became a global superpower with responsibilities and commitments that continue to this day. The world America helped create after World War I was flawed and unstable. Within a generation, it collapsed into an even greater catastrophe. But America's role in that war established patterns and precedents that define American foreign policy even now, over a century later. The decision to enter World War I in 1917 was one of the most consequential decisions in American and world history, and we're still living with the consequences. Hit subscribe to see what happened next.